The Chicago Bulls heading into this offseason find themselves in a bit of a pickle, and here's what I mean. You've fired Tom Thibodeau, you bring in Fred Hoiberg. You would assume that means there's going to be a shift in coaching philosophy, most certainly, and a greater emphasis placed on the offensive side of the ball, which is frankly something that was needed. Now, is Fred Hoiberg going to be the right choice, going to be the right guy to help take this team to the next level? Ultimately, only time is going to tell. But the real pickle comes for the Chicago Bulls in this sense, is that they're a team that's really not that far away. They have a lot of the pieces in place, and if certain things fall certain ways, this is a team that rightfully believes that they at least have a chance to make it to the NBA Finals next season. It could be argued in a weak-ass, bum-ass Eastern Conference, even with LeBron there, that the Bulls are one of those teams that are potentially equipped to be able to beat the Cleveland Cavaliers and make it to the NBA Finals as Eastern Conference champions. However, on the flip side of that is with the Chicago Bulls, as I've talked about for years, a lot of times I felt they've been kind of overrated, and I myself at one point in time during the 2014-2015 season, I think really fell into that trap of overrating them a bit. They lack that something. They lack that special ingredient. And while people look at the pieces sometimes, I don't think the sum of the total is greater than the individual parts. I don't know if I explained that right, but what I mean is that the team just doesn't have it. And I don't think they're as close to having it as people might believe that would take them to that next level where they could go to the NBA Finals next year. So now here we sit with the 2015 NBA draft right around the corner, and the Chicago Bulls own one selection. That's the 22nd overall pick in this draft. And ultimately, the question will be, with a limited amount of draft resources, but not necessarily a whole ton of needs either, what will the Chicago Bulls do with that 22nd overall pick? And maybe most importantly of all, what should they do with that 22nd overall pick? Now, to me, I see four different options in terms of what the Bulls can do in this draft. And they're all potentially options that work and make sense for the organization. Number one would just be sit there at pick number 22 and wait for the board to play out and just take the best player available, regardless of position. Because while they seem to have a good roster and they have some star talent in place with guys like Derrick Rose and hopefully a soon-to-be re-signed Jimmy Butler, Paul Gasol, they've got some star power in place, so you could just sit there and take the best available player regardless of position and assume that that talent will win out him. That player will find a way to make a contribution to that team, whether it be in the immediate future or in the long-term future. And when you're a team like that picking in the 20s, drafting best player available isn't exactly a bad way to go. Sometimes that talent wins out over the immediate need. Because in 2 or 3 years, you might have an immediate need that you didn't forecast before, and that better player that you took and you gambled the draft pick on now is sit there and is able to fill that need. So taking a guy best player available could certainly make a lot of sense. Another option for them is, because they are a team that is close, a team that is on the cusp, many may feel, is it could be a good idea for them to fill a depth need, if you will, and focus on plugging a hole in their roster, because they still have some holes in their roster. They could use a backup point guard with some size and some playmaking ability. They could use a versatile combination power forward, center, 4-5 type of guy that could either play next to Paul Gasol or Joakim Noah, preferably a guy with a little more size than, let's say, a Taj Gibson. You could also maybe be looking for some perimeter shooting, because even if you re-sign a Mike Dunleavy, the Bulls are not a great three-point shooting team. And I guess that's one of those skills that you can never have enough of for an NBA team, are guys that can knock down perimeter shots. And with as much in recent years as the Bulls' offense at times would stagnate, in part because of their lack of perimeter shooting and their lack of ability to effectively space the floor for a penetrator like a Derrick Rose or a Jimmy Butler, a perimeter shooter would make a lot of sense. It most certainly would. Another option here would be just to trade the pick. Not sit there and tie yourself into a guaranteed rookie contract over the next 3 or 4 years for a guy who may or may not contribute right away. and then take that and create yourself some salary cap and roster flexibility. Keep that position open. Keep that money available, especially if you're going to have to look at giving big money to a guy like a Jimmy Butler. Another option could be they could trade that pick and move up. Maybe the future picks aren't as big of a concern, and this team is really one piece away, they feel. So maybe they could sit there and move up from 22 into the tail end of the lottery or shortly thereafter, get a guy that maybe dropped a little bit that can come in and make an immediate contribution. Or maybe they can even go a draft and stash option. And when you're picking around that range in the 20s of the NBA draft, that's something that could be incredibly appealing too. Because you could sit there and take a guy, hide him overseas for 1, 2, 3 years, and let somebody else pay for his development, let somebody else worry about it, and then you could bring that guy in who's going to be a much better player than what you would have drafted them as 1, 2, 3 years ago, and you could still pay them a much lower deal than if you were bringing that player in via free agency. There are a lot of options here for the Chicago Bulls in terms of what they can do. Now, to me, I kind of look at this as a combination of things in terms of what they should do. I don't think trading the pick makes sense for them, especially if they traded it for cash considerations or for a couple of second rounders or even a future first rounder. I just don't think that's the way for them to go. And while I would understand the thought process behind, let's say, trading the pick and not tying yourself into that guaranteed contract, I don't think the Bulls are in that position where that should be that big of a concern. When I look at the draft and stash option, I see a guy like Guillermo Hernangomez from Spain, and he makes a world of sense because he is a guy that you can maybe keep overseas for 1 to 2 years, and at least, if anything else, you could bring him over, still be a guy in his early 20s, potentially replace a Joakim Noah. He could do some of the things, not all the things, mind you, but some of the things that a Joakim Noah can do at a younger age at a much cheaper price. But at that pick, that's about the only real draft and stash option. And I'm not sure for a guy like Hernangomez if that's the guy that the Bulls at least need to be worrying about drafting and stashing at pick number 22. I'd like to see them, if there was a guy with more offensive skill than an Hernangomez that they could draft and stash for a year or two, especially offensive skill out of the post, then we could be talking. But Hernangomez is more of a role-playing big type of guy, maybe at best somebody like a Tiago Splitter type. So I just don't know. While I could understand it, it would make some sense, and it would still be a way for them to have a commodity out of this pick without having to tie up salary cap space right away to them. I'm just not sure it's the best option, although it could be somebody that they take and then later on they trade off, either during this draft or in the future, provide some flexibility. But I really think they need to go best player available while filling a depth need. Looking at the depth needs, whether it be a backup point guard with size and playmaking ability, a combination 4-5 guy with some length, or a perimeter shooter, I think they've got to go best player available that fills one of those needs. I really, really do. Now, when I look at perimeter shooting, where they're going to be picking at number 22, I don't anticipate a lot of quality shooters there. I think, Devin Booker is going to be long gone. R.J. Hunter from Georgia State is going to be gone. I'm just not sure that there's going to be that great perimeter shooter there in terms of a combination 2-3 type of guy. Now, in terms of longer type of 4-5 guys, are there those guys there? Yes, but do they really make the most sense for them? Yeah, I don't know. The problem is, too, is that where you could be looking at certain players in the 22 range are guys like Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, who's an outstanding defender from Arizona, but really doesn't bring much else to the table, at least at this point, or a Kelly Oubre Jr. from Kansas, a guy who can potentially be an elite defender at the NBA level with his athleticism and his length on the perimeter. They already have guys like that. Hopefully they'll retain a Jimmy Butler. They have guys like Tony Snell. I mean, do you want to tie up yet another roster spot to a guy like that? While it's always nice to have another guy like that you could throw into the mix to be able to guard somebody like LeBron James, which has to be a factor in consideration, I'm just not sure the value is there and the need is as big. To me, I look at backup point guard, and I view this as a combination of the biggest need for the Bulls and an area where they can get potentially a good matching in terms of best player available and decent value. When you talk about Derrick Rose and Jimmy Butler playing together, there was some talk late in the season, especially in the playoffs, that these guys were having trouble coexisting. Derrick Rose kind of disappeared late in that series against the Cavaliers, and then Jimmy Butler was trying to establish himself as the alpha male and make sure he was getting paid, basically. There's some problems there, but even more than that, that lack of a backup point guard with size and some playmaking ability has really hurt the Bulls in recent years. It's nice when they could bring guys in off the bench like Nate Robinson or Aaron Brooks, or was it C.J. Miles, whatever the hell, C.J. Watson. But the point is that they would bring in, especially in the case of Robinson and Brooks more so, you bring in these undersized veteran point guards that are limited in what they can do. And while they can bring you some nice things, they're really limited. And when you're looking at the injury history of a Derrick Rose, it's always important, I think, to have a better option at the backup point guard position. And in particular, having a guard with some size at that backup point guard position that you could sit there and provide yourself some additional versatility in terms of what you could do offensively on the floor and even defensively by being able to play alongside Derrick Rose and allowing you to kick Jimmy Butler over to the three, which is a position that he can most certainly play, as he has proven. To me, when I look at the point guard position, a guy like Jerrion Grant from Notre Dame would make a ton of sense. Unfortunately, he probably isn't going to be there at number 22. I know, some people look at a guy like a Tyus Jones and think he profiles well as a backup point guard at the very worst at the NBA level because of his leadership, because of his intelligence for the game. And I don't dispute that. And I think he's going to be a solid starter at the NBA level, potentially in the right situation on the right team. But I don't think he's the right backup point guard for the Chicago Bulls. To me, the guy that I ultimately hope the Chicago Bulls end up with the 22nd overall pick is a guy like Delon Wright, the point guard from Utah. Here's a point guard with size at 6'5", an older prospect, so therefore meaning you hope his learning curve is less on a team that is potentially ready to contend now. Being able to bring in a guy like that right away who, while young, is experienced and might not have the same learning curve and growing pains as other prospects, has a lot of appeal to me. I look at a guy like Wright and I see him as somebody that could play on the floor at the same time as Derrick Rose and at the same time allow you, just as importantly, to kick Jimmy Butler out on the three. Gives you another guy that could be a playmaker on the perimeter, another guy that can handle the ball. To me, that's what the Chicago Bulls should do. Now, obviously, if a guy like Wright isn't there at number 22, then who knows what the hell. Maybe they can hope a guy like Rashad Vaughn from UNLV is there and they gamble on that upside long term. Maybe they decide a guy like Rondae Hollis-Jefferson and his defensive abilities are just too good to pass up on because they have to figure out a way to beat LeBron James. And that might make some sense too, especially if you are going to keep Jimmy Butler long term and you want him to not have to expend so much energy on the defensive end. Maybe a guy like Hollis-Jefferson could eventually develop into a D&3 starter at the NBA level. But to me, ultimately, I look at the Bulls. I think backup point guard is the way to go. There are going to be guys at that position that are potentially available at number 22. And to me, I could argue that it is their biggest need on that team, obviously outside of perimeter shooting. But I want to hear from you, Bulls fans. What do you think the Bulls should do? Do you think they should do a draft and stash like a guy like Guillermo Hernan Gomez? Do you think they should trade the pick? Do you think they should just go best player available? It doesn't matter whether it's a point guard, center, what have you. Or do you think they should go and fill a depth need like I was talking about with backup point guard and a guy like Delon Wright from Utah? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Da Bulls.